Hello everyone. Thank you for showing up to this seminar, series I guess, to this talk that I'm giving today. It's aptly titled Studies in Gameful Interaction Design and Games User Research. That's kind of my research. So I will be talking about myself a lot. Actually, no, about the things that I do. But before we start, because I was told it's always a little bit better if you introduce yourself, because you know most of the stuff about yourself, and somebody just has to read it off of a paper. It's never as engaging, right? So who am I, other than a guy that just likes running around in rooms? I'm an associate professor in games user research and gamification. I'm also the associate director, graduate studies in digital experience innovation at the University of Waterloo Stratford campus, which has just been named. Hi, how are you?
Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, it's been forever. Which has actually just been named University of Waterloo's newest school of interaction design and business. So we just got that past Senate and the Board of Governors. I have a PhD in game development. I studied fun for a long time. I'm also the director of the HCI Games Group at the University of Waterloo. If you want to tweet at me, I'm academic on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn. If you want to connect there, please feel free to do so. I'm always happy to get to know more people or exchange knowledge and share what I know. Okay, that being said, I talked a lot about Waterloo and these names and things, but I always find it better if you can actually put like names, faces to names, right? And so this is the HCI Games Group. That's my research group. This is us in the summer at our maximum size. We tend to inflate a lot over the summer because we tend to take a lot of international research visitors that just come and do an internship with us, write a kite paper, and then go back home to their home universities. Then we have the digital experience innovation students at the Stratford campus, or now Stratford School of Interaction Design and Business. And this is a professional master's program focused on interaction design. And so, yeah, those are the faces to those programs. What am I talking about today? I'll talk a little bit about why I think UX matters and why I think it's important and should be everywhere and everyone should be doing UX. I just had this wonderful tour with Lois around the industrial design facilities, and it is still interesting how sometimes you walk up to a designer or you see a design, and it is still considered a special thing if the design was user-centered, where it is growing and growing to be just a natural thing. It should always be user-centered, right? But this is just a process that we've engaged in the last couple of decades, right? So talk about why I think that's important. And then game UX, the model player experience, talk a little bit about some of the papers I've written. I came out with what I think is quite an interesting breakdown of player experience. And then gameful interaction design, what do we understand under gameful interaction design? I'll show some examples and studies, show off some of my students' work, hopefully get interested in that stuff. Games user research, recently published a book on this. It's blue, you should buy it, Oxford University Press. Yeah. If you really, really want it and you're really keen, send me an email, maybe we can arrange something. There's also a bonus code at the end, so stay until the end. And then I'll give you some closing thoughts and I'll take questions about the stuff. Okay, so what is this? Bunch of things, lots of cool, funny colored icons. But what does it represent for me? It represents this whole complexity that we consider interdisciplinarity in interaction design. Who here has an idea of interdisciplinarity or some idea what that means? What does it mean to be interdisciplinary? Does anyone here have an idea about that? I mean, I know that a lot of people here have an idea about that, but like, does anyone feel like comfortable like saying, okay, I've encountered interdisciplinarity? Okay, how about people that haven't encountered it? Does anyone here feel very disciplinar, like in one discipline? Like, I've only done my discipline. Oh, everyone's just tired and doesn't want to raise their hand. That's fine. Yeah, okay, I get it. It's called interaction design for a reason, people. Okay, whatever. So in interaction design, we actually have to deal with a lot of different influences, right? So we have to deal with people that understand a lot about psychology. They understand a lot about how people function. We have to deal with the people that know all the cogs and the wheels inside of the computer. They know the ins and outs, the binary bits and pieces. We have to deal with industrial designers that actually look and think about the touch and feel of things and how do we actually perceive something, right? So a lot of that. We have to deal with graphic designers that just kind of make everything look good and just know about form and function and all that stuff, right? But all of that has to accumulate in our head somehow to this discipline that's interaction design. And that helps us understand how we can create something that hopefully has an impact on the person interacting with it, right? Like, because The problem, as everyone tells the millennials today, because they're not reading books anymore, because they have so many stimuli everywhere. Why is that? Because UX is mattering. Something is happening. Somebody's creating experiences all the time, right? So you're not sitting in your chair anymore, you're just reading a book. No, the book has to be exciting now. It has to be something more. It has to be an iPad experience. It has to be a movie. It has to be something, right? Like it has to be gripping you, right? And of course, me being in video game design, I'm a little bit biased because, yes, we turn classic stories, classic narratives into video games, highly interactive experiences, try to make something so engaging that somebody just can't put it down for a while, right? Like that is part of what we do in these types of designs. But a lot of these ideas are swapping over into things like using a word processor, using a camera, writing something down with a pen and paper. Thinking about these things, this kind of helps you understand, okay, there has to be more than just the functionality, right? Like more than just getting literally the ketchup out of the bottle, right? And this is kind of an interesting example about how you can look at how this experience design is done, and probably overused example in the UX community. But again, you have this example here of the classic Heinz design ketchup bottle, which is very functional. You know, like the ketchup goes in the bottle, the ketchup comes out of the bottle, and you put the ketchup on the fries, you eat it. It's good, ketchup. But on the other hand, you have this ketchup bottle here. Why redesign the ketchup bottle in the first place? It makes no sense, right? The ketchup bottle was functional, it was working. But at some point, somebody said, oh, you know what? We want to make a ketchup bottle that has a little bit more of an experience attached to it. You know, we want to be able to dose it properly. We want to be able to squeeze it. There's also a marketing aspect here because people found out if you put it in a squeezy bottle, people actually use more ketchup per squeeze than they use in the other bottles. So you could actually sell more ketchup because people started eating more ketchup in the squeezy bottles, right? So clever, clever. So a lot of these things, when we go and look at user experience design, this is something I always tell my students, it's yes, at the heart is the user, and always, you know, we build with the user in mind first, but at some point we're also working for a company and we also got to make money at the end of the day. So that oftentimes is also a company goal attached to how these things are designed. So keep that in mind when somebody always preaches user-centered design, it's all good, but companies are also in the end interested in the bottom line. So it's user-centered, but it's also focused around what makes sense for the business. So you always have to have both in tandem as you're going into industry. And I know a lot of you are researchers, so industry might not be as important right now, but at some point even researchers need to make a living. And so it is important to consider those aspects as well. In any case, this kind of brings this idea to the forefront that in the classic design space, before we got, that's a weird canvas, before we got into this idea of designing user experiences, we really were considered more with something being functional, right? Like usability, these aspects of usability, that, you know, efficiency, effectiveness, satisfaction, like these things really mattered for the longest time when we were building experiences and products. But then at some point people thought, you know, there's a little bit more. We don't just want to do usability, we don't just want to do functional, it's also important what people think and feel about stuff. And then the design and the aspects of the interaction become way more important. And so that's why I think user experience design matters. And I want to tell you a story from my recent field trip, let's call it. You know how when you start, how many of you are grad students? Raise your hands. Students in general, maybe. Okay, that's good. That's a good amount. Yeah. Some of you might have mistakenly entered grad school with the promises of you get to go to conferences in cool places and present your research. That might have, you know, some like. Definitely was a thing for me. I was always like, oh, get to present my research at cool conferences, get back travel costs. It's still a good part of the job. But honestly, like how often do we actually go to cool places, right? Like Kai this year's Montreal. Nothing against Montreal, right? Like Montreal's nice, but it's just next door. It's not Saskatoon, but it's Montreal. Anyways, and so there's nice places and there's not so nice places, but it's wherever the conference ends up. The interesting thing is, sometimes when we're old enough, I think 8 years into my professor job, we can make that decision because we have enough funding. And then we go, okay, there's a good conference. We can get that paper accepted. And whoa, the conference happens to be in Hawaii. So my first time, after 8 years of publishing papers, I got to go to a conference in Hawaii. That was a big milestone in my academic life. Kind of weird. Other people do that all the time. But when I was in Hawaii, I came across this wonderful crosswalk, which is not a crosswalk. Why is it not a crosswalk? Because it's labeled not a crosswalk, so obviously it's not a crosswalk, but it is a crosswalk. So it's actually It's been there for a longer time than humans, not humans, but it's been a longer time than industrialized human development has been there, right? Like these are lava fields that are connected. You can just walk from one lava field to the next lava field, and there's just this natural connection from the original inhabitants of the island, right? And then at some point, somebody just decided we were going to build a big road, and we're going to make sure that the road is properly marked with crosswalks and so forth, and that thing apparently was not supposed to be a crosswalk. And so let's label it as not a crosswalk, even though naturally, just imagine how many people actually walk over that crosswalk, because if it looks and feels like a crosswalk, maybe it should be a crosswalk. And so the whole idea here is that, you know, just by relabeling something or wanting something to be something else, it doesn't necessarily change the human behavior that they would do with that special something, right? So if something looks and feels like a crosswalk, it's probably going to be used as a crosswalk. Another popular image that you've probably seen with this, UX versus usability, where you see the snowy landscape, and then you see that one path that is actually the paved path, and then that path where people just kind of go wherever they want, right? And that's the UX path, right? Like, and it's the same idea behind this thing. It's just essentially you're just following the path that is there, and if it looks like you can walk on it, you probably try walking on it. Labeling doesn't help, doesn't fix it, right? But it also brings us to what is essentially another interesting problem in the UX space is sometimes even little things such as where do we put a label, or where do we put a button, or where do we put the checkout links or the search box are going to make a big impact on the bottom line of a company, and how a company actually makes profit based on their user interaction design or user interface design in that particular case, right? And that is also often part of UX. And it's interesting because there's a lot of fights about terminology. You know, people get angry at people that just say UX. People get angry at people that say UX design. People that get angry at people that say UX research. And people get angry at UI. And sometimes you also read your job postings. So some of you that are studying HCI and you're on the job market and you read the postings, and you get real confused because it's a UI/UX designer. What is that? So yeah, you're trying to understand what that space is, right? And so yes, UX should actually encompass a lot of these fields, but there's very different skill sets. There's a very different skill set for somebody that does UI design, that's really good at probably a bit more in the graphic design aspect. And then there's a space just for UX researchers, for people that are doing classic studies and that know, okay, this is how I design a study. This is a very interesting part. This is why I wanted to take this example, because this is actually, you know, some UI design aspects, but a user researcher doing a classic, what we call an A/B test around these aspects of research. What do you think was A/B tested here, other than, okay, I've labeled it A and B? There's obviously differences in the layout and how this web page is designed. Mountain equipment, probably a couple of people know this aspect, but essentially what changed here is the enter keyword box and the cart or the checkout location that was essentially changed in both of these different website designs. Now the thing is, if we go as a design purist, and you will encounter these people in industrial design departments and in general designers sometimes, how would you know which one's better? Let's get an idea from the crowd. Who thinks A is better? That's the top one. Who thinks design A is better? 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, no. 3, okay. Who thinks design B is better? And who's just tired? Everyone else. 1, 2, 3. Okay, slightly more people, if we don't count the tired people, slightly more people think design B is better, probably because they think checkout should not be on the top right. Now I could show you a different study that actually says that what's happening here is actually based on how people perceive web pages. This is a study from '88, I think. No, from '96. Sorry. So from '96, where they did some heat maps on web pages, and they actually found out that naturally what people are looking for when they look for the search bar is the top right, or not for the search bar, for the most important bit on a web page, they would look on the top right. So that's probably what's happening here, why people would think, okay, so that version is probably the better version. But then again, what we want to do is we want to increase revenue here, right? Like the idea is, how do we increase revenue for this website as a UI designer? And so to increase revenue, probably putting the checkout button to the top would be a good idea. But again, anything until you actually run a study is a hypothesis. And this is something you got to get your mindset in, right? Like, if I quiz you right here and if I quote other studies, that's secondary research. That's all fine and dandy. It's not going to show you how your users actually work until you actually run the study. And this is what they did. They just ran a study. They compared A and B. And then what they compared is specifically how many items would actually go into checkout and into the buying spot of the, so not just putting it in your cart, but actually checking out the item and acquiring it, right? Like, so how many items were being purchased, and then compare A and B. And it turns out that version A increased the revenue by 12%, right? So they measured how many sales confirmation emails were, or how many sales confirmations were given to users, and the increase was 12%. Now, if they, what they did then is, of course, a financial calculation, estimation of how that would influence the bottom line of the company, and that would mean, in average, the company would make approximately $2.3 million more using design number A. And once you start juggling with those numbers, people actually start to understand why UX design is kind of important and why UX research is kind of important, because now you actually have data to back up your decision. And if that decision means you are going to increase the revenue in these aspects, that is a very, very important decision for a company to make. So whenever somebody asks you as a UX designer, what's your actual job? Why are you here? I don't understand it. Well, this is why you're here. You're helping people achieve not just the best user experience, but you're also helping companies achieve the maximum possible outcome that they can achieve, with whatever the outcome may be. It might be a monetary outcome, it might be a different outcome, but as a UX designer, you can solve these problems. As a user researcher, you can also solve these problems. Again, I'm now almost confusing the terms, because you really, at the heart of this is what the user researcher does. The UX designer would implement it, but the user researcher would be the one actually running this study, right? So we all should be, at the heart, user researchers if we're trying to do good UX designs. And this leads us also to a way of trying to understand how UX then works in the aspects of player experience, because again, for player experience, we have a little bit more of a complex situation, because oftentimes it's not so much driven for checkout or other experiences, right? Like, yes, we're starting to have freemium models and other things where, okay, it becomes more how many of these items are going to acquire, but oftentimes in games user research and in game user experience design, what you're trying to build for is a long-term experience. And trying to understand that experience was very, very difficult for the longest time. So this was towards the end of my PhD that I started investigating some of that stuff. And essentially what I did is I tried to cluster experiences into these different levels of interaction and interpretation, where you go from something very concrete that you can measure actually very precisely to something that becomes much harder and much more abstract in terms of our understanding. So at the heart of every experience, you have the technological layer, if you want to call it, right? Something which you would actually have in other experiences too. Oftentimes when we deal with digital media, it is based on some sort of platform, right? That platform influences how we're doing things. It's a gaming device, it's the game. This can be also the gaming platform. It can be the Xbox, the Sony PlayStation. It can be the Nintendo Switch or whatever the current consoles are, right? And so you really have to think about, how can we make sure that it works well on that platform? How can we make sure like all of these things are taken care of on the technical level? You can even think of it, if you want to think of it in terms of computing, what is the software abstraction layer that you have? If you don't want to think about hardware platform, what is the rendering, the things that you actually see, the bug freeness of everything, right? That's the core of any experience. That's the core that builds any player experience. The next thing is the people that are there with you for that experience. Because oftentimes, specifically today, a lot of these experiences are not single player anymore. Even if they are single player, they're often shaped by your own perception of the experience, right? So not just by the other players that are there, but also how do you process it on the player level, because you're also a person, right? We're going from something that we can measure just from the technology to that perception layer, where we as people interpret something, right? And if you've ever taken any course in sensation and perception on the psychological side, you know that this is how we process any kind of information, right? Like anything that's presented here, her head, I think it's purple. You probably think this is a different kind of purple than me, right? Like it is not the same kind of purple for you than it is for me. It's a different kind of processing that's happening here on a sensory level, right? And it's the same with games, right? Like the internal influences that we have, the characteristics that we have are really, really important in how we're trying to understand these experiences. And we actually have done a lot of research recently that goes into this idea of how is this actually done on a personality level, because different personalities interpret things differently. So they also seek out different experiences in games. So we've actually done a lot of research into player personalities and how that shapes their interaction with the game. Now, of course, we're hopping into a whole new layer as we're considering all the factors that are around us, right? Like not just from our base person layer, but now multiplayer experiences, other people being there. We have the social experiences, we have the spatial experiences, and what space are we playing? You know, there's a difference if I play Just Dance or if I play here just with my little controller. It's a very different kind of playing experience, a very different embodied experience, a very different performative aspect to my play. And it shapes how I understand this. Cultural things, right? Like very important things when we're designing video games and we're designing for different cultures. I don't know if anyone has ever seen how Kirby is being presented in Japanese culture versus how it's presented in North American culture. It's way, way cuter in Japanese culture and North American culture. Kirby's starting to get like little eyebrow thingies just to make Kirby look a little bit tougher. Whereas in Japanese culture, it's very round. Kirby's a very happy guy that just likes to eat everything. But yeah, it's sort of a little bit of a difference in how we present that same character for different cultural audiences. And it's not just the characters, it's also the colors that we use and so forth. I grew up in Germany, right? A country that sort of has a little bit of a complex history when it comes to world domination and stuff. And so one of the things that don't really fly well is when you have video games that have a lot of Nazis in it, because there's a lot of symbolism that is actually forbidden in Germany. So what happened is we got all of the modified versions of these games. They were swastikas are actually forbidden to be in popular media in the country, right? And on top of that, our violence restrictions were pretty high. So oftentimes we got very modified versions of how that game was, not necessarily historically accurate, but very, all of a sudden in a very fictional model, which I actually, like as a kid, I didn't mind the difference. I didn't even interpret it or understand it. The most interesting thing for me as an adult when I reflected on it was the game Contra 3, which was called Probotector in Germany. And essentially what they did, they redid the entire game from being sort of Rambo, kind of shoot everything, to two friendly robots that were shooting aliens that bled in green and not in red. Yeah, so essentially they actually redid the game sprites to adjust for that cultural sensitivity and understanding, right? So again, cultural impact is quite important when we're designing these things. Like, what is the culture sensitive to? How do we want to shape that experience? Do we want to expose them to something that they're sensitive to? Probably not. Or how can we do it in a way that they still perceive as positive, right? Again, things that you got to consider when you, and I've used some extreme examples here, but things that you have to consider even in the little when you're doing these user experience or game designs, right? Like, these are important things. Temporal things. Have we interacted with this thing before? Do we already know how to use it? Do we need to do a tutorial? Is there something that we can we just pick up and play? Is there something like a lore attached to it? Is this the ex Lara Croft and we already know how it all works out? Is this yet another Call of Duty? Are we familiar with the interactions and the designs, right? And this leads, to a whole plethora of understanding how this context shapes our experiences. So overall, it's just important that we have something that's very concrete, very easy to measure for us as scientists, and something that's actually really, really hard to approximate as scientists, and sometimes we like to call ourselves scientists. And so it's like as researchers, let's say, as user researchers, it is actually really hard to pinpoint some of these parts of experience. So user experience is a hard nugget to crack, right? It's not something that we can just easily say, oh, I got the user experience figured out. Well, you get an approximation of the user experience. But user experience, as you all know, is a second-order design problem. Nobody actually designs experiences. You design artifacts that trigger experiences, but you don't design the experience. Like, I can't just go in there and plug something in like the Matrix and like download the experience onto your brain. It doesn't work that way, right? I can put something in here and be like, high five. And you have that experience of hitting that artifact, and you're like, okay, this could be good. You don't seem very excited by hitting my hand, but some people might be. So again, like, and for me, I would find out, is this experience that I designed, is it a good experience, is it a bad experience? And then I would probably do a post-interview with you and just like, how did you like hitting the hand? And we'd find out, is this a good experience? Does it work for you as a user? And then we'd have that understanding. And then we can get that approximation. Okay, we're designing these experiences, and that's the impact that they have. But we don't actually design the experience. We just design the artifact that creates it. And that leads us to gameful interaction design, because when we use games, we also like to use games for these things that create joyful, pleasant experiences, right? Like in interaction design, we're generally just interested in the interaction design, in the interactions, in the things that we do. But in gameful interaction design, we're taking that one level further. We want to motivate people. We want to actually go from not just, okay, it's pleasant to interact with, but here's a layer that we can add that you actually want to use it, because this triggers something that we know is positive for you. So first we got to understand what is actually positive for people. Well, one of the things, and this is one of the games I was stuck with last summer, so one of the things that we actually really enjoy is novel information, right? Like that's something our brain really likes, and this is part of why you're on social media a lot, because you like digesting new information all the time. Yeah, it's just a neurophysiological pleasure of the brain when we see these things. Oh, there's something more. Oh, no, I'm zero. This is good. I found it all. Oh, and this is what I got. And look at all these other things. And this thing is open, and that thing's open, and now it's fudging, and stuff is like it's everywhere, right? Like I'm excited. There's so many things that I can find out that I don't know anything about, and that it's telling me, oh, there's something in there. There's these treasure chests that are also sort of treasure chests in your brain, where you're trying to get at that information, that fresh information that might help you improve your strategy, your interaction strategy in general, but in games also just your general gaming strategy, right? Like these things are very, very powerful for you. And it's not just that cognitive processing of this new information that makes us happy and excited about games, but it's also this idea, and some of you already know that if you've taken the occasional course on interaction design, because self-determination theory is one of the theories that tends to show up. And it is a little dated by now, I give you that. There's better theories emerging. But it is one of the theories that helps us understand why we tend to like this novelty, why we tend to like these challenges, because it essentially what it boils down to is it allows us to learn and improve ourselves. And this whole concept of doing something for personal self-improvement is essentially one of the core drivers of what Ryan and Deci in this theory call intrinsic motivation, right? We've essentially, the theory bases the assumptions on that there's something called intrinsic motivation coming from inside of us, and something called extrinsic motivation, something that is used from the outside to kind of pull this out. And there's sort of this push and pull is always there in games, right? Like if we say we just do intrinsic games, we would be lying. No, there's always extrinsic and intrinsic. The problem is, as gamification became really popular, a lot of people only saw the extrinsic aspect. So those are easy to design. Any ideas what an extrinsic aspect of a video game could be? Nope. Points, gold stars, leaderboards, that kind of stuff, right? Like badges, all of the stuff that people just did all the time, right? And just thought, okay, if I'm going to give you a badge for reading your Facebook post, you're going to be happy. Like if it's something you don't care about, like adding a badge or a star or a point to it, it won't matter to you. I recently experienced that. I just 3 weeks ago, I got a big extrinsic reward. I got a Arts Excellence and Research Award. And so for me, it was just like, why am I even happy about this? I've done this research. I shouldn't be happy about a stupid extrinsic reward. I know this is like just stupid badge. Like, what am I going to do with it? But the reason that I was happy that I started to understand is that I actually saw all the stuff that went behind it, like all the years of hard work and just trying to understand and publishing papers and all that stuff. So it's sort of, knowing that you actually wanted to be recognized for your work and then receiving that recognition, that push and pull is exactly what made that good feeling in that moment, right? So I think that's the interesting thing to understand, that the one always works a little bit with the other. And if you say, okay, just the badges or just the intrinsic, it won't work. It's usually this connection that makes it so powerful. And again, if we break it down into the 3 core components of what makes the intrinsic motivation, we have these ideas of competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Competence essentially means you're doing something that you actually feel competent in doing, something that you feel you can function effectively, you're getting enough feedback to do the things that you need to be doing, that you're learning as you're going, you don't feel like the threshold is too high, you're starting to understand it. Autonomy means that you also have the ability to fail. You have the ability to influence and set your own goals. You have the ability to not have somebody restrict your understandings and your interactions, right? Like you have that freedom essentially. And then relatedness, this feeling that what you're doing actually has an impact on other people. It's not just an impact on you, it's an impact on everyone around you. This is really powerful for humans. We tend to always underestimate that effect, but doing something that somebody else can also see and connect with is part of why these social games work really well. It's part of why social interactions are something that a lot of us are striving for. Even if we're introverted people, we still oftentimes take a pleasure in some of these social interactions, as long as they're not, too much trying to intrude into our lives. But there's actually a really strong driver in these. And I wanted to give you a breakdown of what I think has actually been a really nice model that we've developed around this concept. It's called the user type Hexad model. And that's sort of, taking some of these understandings that we have from self-determination theory and putting that in that layer of understanding the player layer, the understanding of what is the player, how do I interpret and process information, what are my personalities. And I realized I should have probably plugged something audio in. Let's see, maybe this will work, maybe not. It's not working. Is there an audio plug?
Gamification applies elements of games in non-game contexts. To do this, it uses some mechanics of most effective introduces the Hexad scale, which determines user
right. It's very quiet. That's not a problem.
By understanding the player's preferences, we can better understand user behavior and develop more effective gamified systems. Our research developed and validated a standard survey for the Hexad framework, in addition to confirming its effectiveness for creating personalized gameful systems. This research also verified a number of game design elements that appeal to each Hexad type. There are 6 user types in the Hexad framework. Philanthropists are users that like helping others. They are motivated by a feeling of having purpose and are highly altruistic. They want to make a contribution or offer a helping hand regardless of what they receive in return. Socializers enjoy interacting with others and are motivated by the ability to relate to others. They like design elements that allow them to establish relationships and build social connections. Our results supported the hypothesis that socializers are drawn to guilds, teams, and social networks. Free spirits like environments that allow them to independently explore the area or express themselves. They want their actions to be impediments.
And you can see we actually identified the elements in the games that these people like.
Elements such as exploratory tasks, Easter eggs, and learning new skills. Achievers want to complete all the tasks, beat all the levels, and take on every challenge. They are motivated by the desire to be competent at everything they do. Our results supported the hypothesis that achievers like design elements that let them prove their capabilities, such as certificates, quests, and challenges. Players want extrinsic rewards. In other words, they want to reach an objective that is external from their original task.
And again, the name may be a bit off-putting because it's really a little bit more like what a gambler would enjoy, right?
Status, completing an activity. In addition, players are interested in participating in virtual economies. This Hexad type is focused on what they will earn and does not care what they need to do to get that reward. Disruptors do not let things stay idle or come from
This is the most rare type that you can encounter in games.
get a kick out of pushing the system boundaries. This disruption can work towards making valuable changes to the system or by testing the limits of other players' patience. Our results show that some design elements that meet disruptors' need for change are voting mechanisms, innovative platforms, and development tools. If you're interested in learning more about
Okay, so so essentially this was done together with a company in the UK, Gamified UK, and Andrew Maczewski. And the idea is essentially that we worked with him because he had identified a lot of these elements that you could say are gameful design elements that you can add to your designs to make them more gameful. And we really wanted to know how it's tied to the different personalities. So that's where a lot of that came from. And in the end, in most of this is actually my PhD student's work, Gustavo Tendella's work. helped us understand, so how do we get to these drivers, these individual drivers, these external drivers, and these social drivers, to just kind of try and re-quote some of the important aspects of self-determination theory. How do we get these different rewards that make up a lot of these? And essentially in a follow-up questionnaire that we did with 196 users, we came to the realization that a lot of the narrative aspects, immersion and progression, things that kind of help us shape and understand what the story of the game is and how we can engage with that, were a lot of drivers for this individual motivation that would keep somebody just motivated by themselves. And a lot of these external drivers that if you take them away, you'd actually, you wouldn't feel a lot of self-drive, were the things such as risk-reward things, incentives in the game, customization options. And then the strongest things, the strongest drivers for people to be motivated and engage with the system again, were these bits here. The ability to socialize in the game, the ability to get some sort of assistance in the game, and even something that triggers some form of altruism, where you have the form to donate or interact with somebody else, to lend a helping hand to somebody that's playing the game. Those are very strong drivers for people to return to playing the game if they haven't engaged for a long time. Part of why games like World of Warcraft or other online, massively multiplayer online games curate the creation of guilds and other social forms and networks that help people stay engaged with these video games. And this is kind of one of the things where that all started with this idea of calibration games, which is essentially one of the first projects that we did, that we tried to overcome the monotony of these tasks, and we tried to add some of these elements. And these were the first elements, so it's a little bit upside down because I'm presenting essentially where we've gone from here, but I wanted to say where we started was essentially with challenge, theme, reward, and progress. This was one of the earlier papers that we wrote, and we just kind of broke it down into those 4 core elements. And then later, Maciejewski's work and all the other stuff identified all these other elements that just kind of built on that. But if you wanted to break it down to something that is very core, you could still use that as sort of a guiding, understanding breakdown of what is actually possible in these gamified systems. I had another video here of Clever, but I'm just going to say check that out on YouTube because the video sound is not so great here. So Clever was a gameful design that we just did for a knowledge translation, knowledge learning game. And that we later evaluated for its effectiveness using a new set of heuristics that we actually developed for gameful design. So heuristic evaluation is actually something that a lot of you that are in interaction design are somewhat familiar with. Some of you might have heard of Nielsen's 10 heuristics. And essentially what we were missing for the longest time are heuristics for when you're implementing gameful designs and actually looking at how effective is that gamefulness. And so we analyzed a lot of different heuristics that were out there until we came up with this list of overarching heuristics that are good for gameful designs that fit into these different categories: intrinsic, extrinsic, and context-dependent heuristics. And again, if you want to know more about that, I would say read the paper, but it's just a really nice guideline that helps you evaluate effectively and quickly whether or not your gameful design is hitting some of these aspects that are important to be motivating, to be actually engaging on the short term. And with that, I want to hop over to another important research area that I'm talking about, which is games user research. Now, in games user research, who can imagine what games user research is? I mean, some of you have heard user research, so you're probably familiar with the idea. Anyone got any ideas what you do in user research?
Test, you have people play games, you notice the responses, what they like, what they don't like.
Exactly. So essentially, yeah, you try and find out what they like about games, why they would buy the games as a product, what kind of things in games do they like, you know, what do they do with the game, how can you change your business model to actually cater towards what people want, how should the product be made, how does all of that come together. And again, a lot of it is of course inspired by the things that we know from interaction design. Now in our wonderful book, we have an entire chapter dedicated to all these different games user research methods. And as you can see here, a lot of the methods in the industry are not 100% overlapping with the methods that we use and engage with in academia, but there are a lot of overlaps, such as things like focus groups and interviews. We already know how to do that. But then in games, we have specific things like extended play tests or benchmark play tests, where we're trying to compare the player experience of that particular game to something that we already have as a benchmark in a similar genre, and we're just kind of trying to match that certain experience. You know, if we're doing a jump and run, or if we're doing something that's a first-person shooter, there's certain benchmarks that we just kind of want to hit in terms of what the experience should be, how should you engage in in a firefight, how should you get out of it, all of that stuff would be tested in this. Other things that are familiar from other areas are unmoderated usability tests. So in games, of course, because it's a highly digital environment, you can have a lot of tracking of metrics and a lot of understanding of some of the interaction aspects. And you can do all of that without a moderator being present and then analyze the data after the fact. Another thing that I want to point out that I actually think is really, really helpful also in other aspects of game design is write testing. Has anyone ever heard about write testing? It stands for rapid iterative testing and evaluation. And this is something that was made popular by Microsoft Games User Research Studios, actually end of the early 2000s, I think it was. And so essentially what it was is instead of running a full-fledged user research test, getting 20 people in, doing the analysis, and then doing an iteration, it was just like, basically you bring in one person, you have the devs there with you for the same day, you run one test until you find the first issue. You note the issue, you go to the devs, you make sure that that issue gets improved, and then you build the next, you build the next version, thank you. You build the next version of the software, in this case the game, and then you test again with the next person. And then you fix it, and then you test again. And then you fix it, and then you test again. So it's really short cycles of like 1 or 2 days, and then you have a dev day in between depending on how much you need to fix this particular issue. And then you do it again, and over and over and over. So you fix very tiny issues, but you fix them all the time instead of like identifying a lot of issues. Has anyone actually ever written a proper user research report or usability report? Maybe. So those of you that have probably know usually what we do is, we tend to get all the issues, we write them down, we address, usually we do a severity rating, and we say, okay, this is the most important for you to fix, and this is sort of nice to have, lower on your scale. And then we usually make some design recommendations or suggestions of how we would say you could improve upon that issue, right? And as you know, these things take a lot of work, but people also usually pay a lot of money for these kinds of reports, which is kind of the job of a user researcher. But in this case, you don't even have to make the report. You just have to address the issue, and you need that buy-in from the team, but specifically from management and specifically from the devs, so that you can go and get those resources right away, because that is not very common in games user research or in game development in general. Okay, so that's just introducing some of the general methods that we have there. One of I just wanted to point out some of the core ones that I think we use a lot in our research and that are not necessarily always used in the same amount in that diagram. One of the things is observation, of course, which is one of the core techniques. We're just observing how the users are interacting with something, and then hopefully, based on that observation, we can make some inference of their interaction with the product, and hopefully some suggestions on how to improve on that interaction. But oftentimes, behavioral observation is followed by an interview or something to actually make sense of the what you saw and understand the why, because the why, it doesn't come out of the observation, just the what happened, right? But another thing that's interesting, and that I actually ended up trying to combine with some of the observation methods, and some of my former students went really deep into that. So it's of course this idea of physiological sensors. When I did my PhD, one of the core things that I tried to understand is, can we quantify emotions, and can we quantify fun in some sort of way? And so this is when I started looking at some of these different sensors, EEG sensors, electroencephalography. Those are sensors that you put on the scalp, on your head. Skin sensors, galvanic skin response, or electrodermal activity. Those are sensors that you usually put on your hand or your feet, trying to get an idea of how aroused you are, so how excited are you in a game. Heart rate, similar measures for some of these measures can also be used for cognitive processing. Muscles, and again, you can measure all sorts of muscles on your body, but the most interesting ones are, of course, the facial muscles, because we express a lot of our emotions through our face, right? Like we're smiling, frowning, and those trigger different muscles. So we use that a lot for emotional detection. And then, of course, eye tracking, just kind of looking at what are people focusing on. We have things like gaze paths, but more important are dwell times, where people are just like focusing on something, and then their pupil will dilate, and that means they're processing a lot of information. So if you're looking at a part of the slide and your pupil dilates, then I have succeeded, because you're actually taking in a lot of that information on the slide, right? So you have to understand that a lot of these things give you little bits and pieces of what could constitute this whole emotional picture of what's happening inside the game world. The problem is, nobody's got the time. It takes a lot of time. This kind of analysis takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of understanding of processing of signals and all that stuff. It is very, very cumbersome. So we were looking at some of these things that help improve upon that. And I think my colleague Pajman, former student, now colleague, spoke here as part of this series a while ago as well about some of the stuff that he's done in his PhD. And this was a project we did together on the Biometric Storyboards, where essentially we're looking at creating what is a single user experience graph, right? Like something that encompasses what the difference is between what the user experienced and what the designer actually intended to be experienced. Again, addressing that second order design problem that we're designing for an experience, but we're not quite sure if that's actually the experience that we're designing for. So how do we check that? And so again, we try to get most of the things that we can get. We try to get the feedback from the users so they could review the video, annotate things in this graph, and just kind of click on, okay, this is what I thought was a very important moment for me. We would have things such as different emotional indicators saying, okay, now the person is in a happy state, now they're in a sad state. So there's obviously some emotional action happening there. The idea about, okay, we can be very excited about parts of the game and not so excited about other parts of the game. That's essentially what you see here. This is just a regular version of an arousal graph of the electrodermal activity. The problem with that is it drifts over time. You need to kind of filter the signal a little bit because there's jittery aspects of it. So it's not 100% accurate, but it is nice if some aspects, some peaks that you can see here actually match some of the peaks that you would have in your designer drawings, because we would ask the designers beforehand to just kind of draw out the experience, the things that we call beats in a video game, right? Like this is a beat and this is a beat of the game because this is an action that needs to happen here and this is an action that needs to happen here. These are the two things that we want to experience, that we want people to experience in this part of the game and that part of the game. So are we achieving that or not? That you can check with some of these graphs. And you can actually go through it rather quickly. And we had those colors too to just say, okay, now you're here, now you're there. This is really helpful. And that was, I think for us, that was a nice step towards how we can inform industry and help them understand some of these aspects of physiological evaluation. And again, there's lots more to talk about there. I wrote an entire book about that, my PhD. So if you want to know more about that stuff, I could talk about that for hours, but it wasn't really the focus of today's talk. So I just kind of wanted to pitch it in there as one of the things that are nice. And of course, we wanted to use these same measures when we're coming to VR now. Now, VR has got its own challenges with the big headsets and the stuff that you got to wear. But one of the things that I was super interested in, and I was so pumped when I pitched this project to one of my visiting researchers last summer, and I said, you know what, I really like studying music and sound in games, and I really want to understand how that influences our experience, because I think it's actually understudied, like how the musical and the sound aspects of games impact it. If any of you want to study that, please contact me. I'm super pumped about this. There's not enough people doing research in this anyways. So music and sound, so we set out, did the study, and I've done 5 or 6 studies on this right now, and never have I found any good results on the physiological side, probably partially because of the complexity of the games as a stimulus. But again, we go into VR. So in VR, I was thinking the VR experience would probably be enhanced if there's sound and if there's this audio, specifically some sort of horror experience. So we picked this game, Vanishing of Ethan Carter, sort of horror, kind of detective horror game. But again, the problem is this is a game, and partially the problem and the reason why we picked it is because it has such a nice implementation on a PC, and then that exact game on the PC was ported into VR. Just kind of adjusted a little bit, but not too much. But the experience was kind of tried to be kept the same. So we were like, okay, let's compare it then in terms of the visual impact that you have if you're playing it on a PC, than if you're playing it in VR. And hypothesizing in VR, there should be more bang to it, right? Because you're feeling so immersed, the sound should make a big difference. Turns out it makes no difference. It doesn't actually matter to people that much. The visual stuff is very important to them, but the sound they couldn't care less. And there's a lot of hypotheses I have about that. Partially, video game designers in general don't actually put a lot of emphasis on sound. It's usually the last thing that people deal with in video game design, unfortunately. But there's also maybe other things. In this case, just probably the prominence of the visual experience. As you might know, is there anyone who's ever done VR experiences at home or for research, usually more than 10 minutes and you get a little bit of nausea, and it's actually it's really hard to stay in that stuff for hours and hours on a time, because it actually, depending on what kind of camera movements you have, but some of these camera movements actually make you quite sick, right? Because you just have that disconnect. Avoiding these forced camera movements was one of the things that we really found was really, really important when we were evaluating this stuff. and limiting the session time. But also, what we found is essentially, yeah, the sound didn't really matter. What mattered to people was this exploration aspect, this aspect of being able to look wherever they wanted to and just exploring that wide world. You know, it didn't actually matter that much that, you know, they had to clear up some sort of murder. It was like, oh, look, beautiful, all this environment. It's a lush environment in Ethan Carter, right? Like, oh, there's this train bridge and there are flowers and butterflies. And so people just like very excited about this exploration, but it didn't matter. We had different types of sound in the background. Didn't matter, didn't enhance anything. Couldn't, well, at least on the physiological level, we could not say it had an impact. And this is the third or fourth study where I have tried to show an impact with physiological measures and I have failed to do so. So, but that's not a bad thing because that means, okay, we have a better understanding of that, and you know, research means we have to be able to falsify some of these ideas that we originally have, and some of our hypotheses might be wrong. So what are the takeaways from today's talk? UX design matters, as I said at the start, because it can improve the perception and success of products, systems, and services. Super important, everyone kind of already gets that here because you're kind of wanting to be UX experts, but if you go out there and you need to sell this to anyone, this is how you sell it. Engaging player experiences depend on context, players, and game systems. So remember those different layers, context, players, and game systems. Gameful design is most effective when personalized. I showed you some of these things, how we personalize gameful design using personalization approaches, the brain hacks model, if you want to look that up. Games user research uses many different methods for scientifically evaluating experience. We've shown you some. The ones that I personally like the most are observation and physiological sensors, but there's way more that you can use for that. And finally, audio and virtual reality is not as pronounced as we expected it to be. So that's something where I think we need more research in that space. And I hope we will do more research. So as we're closing up, one of the things I want to give you with as research ideas, because you're researchers, you probably need cool project ideas, and you probably have enough, but like some of my ideas anyways, if you ever want to work with me. I think sensors are becoming more pervasive, so I want to understand how humans actually manage embedded, supporting, and sometimes controlling technologies. Like, how do we understand these technologies? And then game technology is becoming more immersive. So I've actually talked to a bunch of people today that said, can we use it for more than gaming? Can we use it to educate people? You know, health application, knowledge management. There's so many potentials for using this game technology. Why don't we do more with that? And I know we are doing more than that, but I want to see even more. Like, I want to see it applied in so many different areas. Also, buy this book. It's amazing. This code gives you 80%, no, 30% discount. 80% discount if you talk to me. No, kidding. Maybe 50. Anyways, good book. And that's it. That's my talk. Thank you very much. And questions? Yes.
I have a question about general game UX. I suppose if the users will get bored easily will be one of the criteria of game UX, right? Like the people that
Unless you're building a game that's all about the boredom, which let's not rule that out. Like, but yes, I would say, well, what we have to understand with games is that engagement comes in different forms. So there's sort of this mellow form of engagement, like Sudoku, and there are different forms of engagement that are more highly interactive, that you feel like, okay, I need to go through something visceral. Call of Duty first level, everything explodes. Like you're actually doing very little in, I don't know if you've played any of the Call of Duty, but usually in the first levels of these cinematic games, I think even Uncharted or some of them, you go in and really you just do 2 or 3 clicks, but it's just like boom, and camera movements and splash and water and everything. You're just being drawn into that world, just trying to create that sensory experience for you. And other games are very, very much about just letting yourself go with the flow. One of my favorite games, Peggle, same thing. You actually don't really have a lot of game control. It's just like boom, boom, boom. There's a little pachinko machine, the ball is just bouncing around. And in the end, yeah, if you get all the orange balls, then woohoo, party and rainbows and stuff. It's very, very great rewards for something that's actually very little effect on your part. But those can be very engaging and very fun experiences, but very different type of engagement that they would trigger. But yes, at the start, when you come in and you want to validate the design, you essentially, the designer will set you a design goal as a game UX researcher and will come to you saying, this is our design goal for today. What ideas do you have to check for that design goal? And then as a user researcher, you would make recommendations how you could check for that design goal.
Okay, so actually, if you want to make a decision, you have to do it very early. Because
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Because you are going to develop it.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have to decide it before you develop this.
Yeah, One of the very interesting things in our book is actually that we talk about what user research methods are best at what stage of game development, because some methods are much better for early stage development and some methods are much better for later stage development. But we definitely encourage testing from day one, right? You definitely want to test as you go along. And a lot of the game mechanics aspects you can even already test on paper. Like, not all of it, but a lot of them you can already test. And then you go into very plain and simple prototype 2D kind of stuff. For some of the mechanics. Again, when I say mechanics, it's some of these core interactions that you do in the games. You can map some of the 3D interactions that you would have on a 2D very simple game, and you could test that out already. So not always done, but some game studios do it rather early on. And specifically Ubisoft has a lot of testing, Electronic Arts and Blizzard. They all have really big testing facilities. They do it throughout the process and really focus on each mechanic. So again, the designer would say, this is the mechanic we're going to focus on today, jumping, or I was actually there, probably shouldn't talk about this on camera. Anyways, okay, anyways, yeah, okay. Yes?
Games these days seem to be being built for much longer experiences than in the past, and games are made now to evolve over time and to like really capture users for years.
Yeah.
How do you design research for that when you have people come in for a couple hours at a time?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, because you're essentially asking, we really need some more long-term studies for some of these highly engaging experiences. And yeah, I'm actually not really aware of a lot of long-term studies. A lot of it, a lot of the things that are long-term engaging are actually about providing fresh content, like World of Warcraft things, and then you test each iteration cycle, you test the fresh content coming in, and the other stuff is based on the social motivation. So that is just based on the research that we have about social interactions and drivers of social interaction. And yes, some of these studies actually are long-term ethnographic studies, specifically in World of Warcraft. There's a bunch of research from, when was the big heyday? 2007, 8. A lot, yeah. Like basically, all my colleagues were playing World of Warcraft and selling it as research. That was like 2 years when every game researcher was playing World of Warcraft. Whatever. But there's a lot of research in that space, right? So that you could build on trying to understand what are these social drivers that people engage with. A lot of it, yeah, ethnographic or auto-ethnographic. People just kind of talking about their own experiences. But yeah, you're right. Like, do we want to have solid long-term studies? Probably. Do people do it? I know they do it along the lines of telemetry, right? So a lot of the games that are out there right now, each iteration cycle, let's say Assassin's Creed, right? Like every iteration of Assassin's Creed dutifully collects data at every time you play it, and all of that data is used for the next iteration of that specific series, right? So a lot of these big franchises are doing that, like, and specifically on the consoles, that's all the data that's being sent. If you ever put on, you know, a little network sniffing protocol when you play World of Warcraft, and you see all the data that's being sent, like there's a lot of interaction data being sent with these games that are always online. And yeah, part of the reason that they need to be always online is because they need to send back that telemetry data for people to make sense of. Problem is, it's actually too much data, and you know, people were not building new scientists quick enough that actually know how to visualize and break down that data. So I think the industry kind of went through that struggle trying to get better user researchers, but we're at that point where people are actually making sense of that data. There's enough machine learning out there that people get really good at predicting patterns from that data. My colleague Anders Drachen, who's a co-editor of that book, actually has a wonderful chapter in our book about that specific aspect of telemetry. I can only recommend this book. What can I say? Just kidding. Okay. Other questions? Yes?
A silly question.
There are no silly questions.
First of all, I'm not a gamer. I don't hardly play any games, but I grew up with this sort of notion that playing too much game is not good for you. There's no judgment here. I'm not making any judgment. I'm just saying, I'm just curious that in your game designing career, or as a researcher, is there any research on how to make games not too sticky?
Yeah, there's two aspects, right? Like one aspect that you're talking about is activities that if you do them too much, they can become a problem, and it can actually become sort of a downside of that behavior. And that's not just games. That can be gardening. That can be any entertainment activity. Anything that brings us pleasure is usually something we have a tendency to do too much of. That's a lot of things that we actually like doing and that we could do too much of. It's not just video games, but video games usually, you know, they get the short end of the straw and they get discussed in public and all that. That's fine. But so what do I think in terms of actively trying to prevent that? A good video game is not actively trying to get you into this whole Skinner behavior model where it's just trying to exploit you in a way that gambling would. That is gambling. And yes, a lot of games that have freemium models actually are on the borderline of employing some of these gambling mechanisms. That is not good video game design. That is not an actual video game design. That's a gambling design. That's a very interesting Skinner box behavioral mechanism that they exploit with reward cycles, for sure. And that is a mechanic that's available, but that's not necessarily at the heart of good video game design. And so, yes, as a designer, it really depends on what's your objective. Is your objective to succumb into that world of trying to exploit the behavioral matrix and trying to just kind of get some of these mechanism integrated in your game? Or again, gambling can be integrated in any activity. It doesn't have to be a game. It could be, could be in Word or other applications as well, if people tended to choose so, but they usually don't, right? So with wanting to integrate that, it should also come the need to wanting to integrate the opposite mechanisms, which you could. You could integrate mechanisms that actually prevent you from engaging too much in an activity. Some games have mechanisms that say, okay, your video game character is actually tired right now, you need to refresh and rest and things like that. Loading screens that tell you take a break every once in a while. We had that for the longest time, that it says, you've been playing for 50 minutes, take a look outside. Or I think World of Warcraft had that loading screen that says, well, friends in World of Warcraft are really good, but you should also make an effort to meet them in real life and things like that. So there are tiny bits and pieces that people are undertaking to try and help with that. But if there's any research into that, probably not a lot, because I'm not aware of a lot of research into that. Why would that be the case? Partially, I would say, because what I said at the start with UX design, there's always a company bottom line and what's good for the user, right? And there's always that fine balance. And if a company can make a lot of money with something that's X, then it is up to us as designers that are working for that company, how much of that company goal are we willing to let into our UX practice. So again, it's up to all of us that are becoming designers to think about ethical, responsible design, because you always have these opportunities. Whether you design a big button for a website that sells somebody an extra insurance as you're entering a flight, a trip booking, or whether you're designing a video game. These dark patterns can be used anywhere. So just be a conscious designer is all I can say to that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Those are all my follow-up questions.
Okay, perfect.
I think we have to call the formal part of the session to close.
Okay.
And thank Lennart.
Bye, YouTube.
If you
Okay.
still have questions, please stick around.
Okay.
And I just want to say thank you so much for coming. We have a little gift for you.
Everyone.
Open it up.
Is it
because-
pens? No.
No. And also, thank you so much to NSER for funding our wonderful seminar series. And if you haven't signed it, there's some people who came later.
It's a pen
Please
holder.
sign it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
I've always wanted one of these.
I'm waiting to see it be a clue. It's supposed to say clue on it.
Yeah.
So that's coming.
It's cute though. Yeah.
Anyway, so please feel free to stay and ask Lennart any questions you want. And that's it. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.